God, we're grateful for this day. Every day you give us new opportunity to love, opportunity to learn, opportunity to draw closer to you. And so may this time be your time, and may you do with it what you will. In Christ's name, amen. Amen. So if you were to come into my office, you would see this, a lithograph of this painting. This is, many of y'all know, and some of you are tired of me talking about him, one of my favorite modern artists. He just died about 2 years ago. His name was John Swanson. And he is a Hispanic artist and is known for these really bright colored, vivid biblical images. And as a going away gift from my last church, I got a real signed, to me it's a really big deal. But they chose St. Francis to give me. And this is St. Francis feeding the birds. And it's beautiful and colorful. But I've been gone from that church for a decade now, and it's beginning to have more meaning for me as I have gone away from that church, because my time in that church was a little bit, it was lovely, okay, but it was pretty revolutionary. It was a time of deep change and upheaval, and the people who bought this were trying to honor me by saying, you were able to lead us through that the way St. Francis led the church. Well, the more I've learned, of course, about St. Francis, I'm like, no, we are nothing alike. But it was a nice thought. It was a really nice thought. I'm not going to be able to talk about any of this in my sermon today. So, you're the only ones who are going to get this information. So let's just run right into it. Because what I really want to do is I want you to learn what you want to learn about him, but I more want to talk about the impact that Francis has had on the church and still can have on our lives of faith. So I want to get to that. To understand the story of St. Francis, you have to know what was going on in what is now Italy. It was not Italy at the time. What is now Italy in the year 1200. Well, I don't know about you, but I know very little about the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages in Italy. And just to give you a slight piece of what's going on, do you see the part that has the red outline? Those were the outline of the kind of Italian city-states. This was a different kingdom. This part of Italy, obviously, was under different rule, Sicily, but it was not a united country. It wasn't until the mid-1800s that Italy became a country the way we know it. And there were two really powerful political powers in this part of the world. There was the Holy Roman Empire, and there was the Papal State. And so here's the Papal State right here, Rome in the middle, being ruled by popes. And the Holy Roman Empire was sweeping into Italy all the way from Germany. At the time, in 1200, the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire was actually a German king. If you look right here, right outside of the Papal States, is the little town of Assisi, which was connected to the Papal State, and a little town of Pergua, which was connected to the king of the Holy Roman Empire. So it was very fluid. That's a nice way of saying things were politically really fluid. And because they had had a feudal system in the Dark Ages, when they moved into this time period, the High Middle Ages, before the Renaissance, look at where Italy was. All of a sudden, it became a really great place for trade and for commerce. And so unlike other parts of Europe, the individual states, though they might ally themselves with the Pope or ally themselves with the Holy Roman Empire, they had their own kind of power, their own government. And so they really had almost old-fashioned Greek city-states throughout all of Italy. A really interesting, mucky time. So you have the rise of the merchant class, you have the rise of powerful city-states, and Sicily has been overtaken by Muslim rulers. So I don't think we understand, because we don't study history properly. This is the time period, remember, when certain kinds of Muslim rulers and sultans had moved all the way into Spain and moved all the way across Italy. So a lot was going on. There was a lot of conflict, a lot of change happening. And the church, remember, there was only one church, the Roman Catholic Church. The split between the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic Church, it had just happened. It had just happened. And it happened partly because of this Holy Roman Empire and all that kind of stuff. But what is left is a very power-hungry political ruler in Rome, very savvy pope, trying to make alliances with these city-states, having alliance with some and not with others. And it meant that the church's focus, if you're busy having to get political alliances with people, the church's focus tended to not be so much about spreading the gospel, taking care of the poor, all those kind of things. So the situation is just ripe for something new to happen, right? And into this situation is born Giovanni. Now here is Swanson's great picture of the young playboy Giovanni with his father Pietro and his mother Pica. He was born and baptized in 1182. His father wasn't there. He was away on a trip. He was a very wealthy merchant, and he had to go to places to buy silk and stuff. So the baby's born, and the mother, Pica, she quickly goes and has him baptized because she wants him baptized the name Giovanni. The father did not want that name. But the way it worked back then, once it had been baptized in the cathedral in the middle of town, you couldn't change the name. So he was Giovanni, and immediately when Pietro gets back, he gives him the nickname Francis. That has to do somewhat, he didn't want him to be, Giovanni is after John the Baptist. And Pica, we think, now remember this is 1200, we don't have a lot of records. The legend is she was a woman of great faith. She wanted him named after John the Baptist. Pietro said, my son will not be named after someone who's poor and itinerant and ignorant. I want a great name. And so he named him Francis in honor of the French that he traded with. His upbringing would have been very typical of middle-class merchants. They were not nobility, but they were wealthier than most of the nobles in the area. So education, frolic, fun, and frankly, debauchery. Assisi was actually known for being kind of a rough place. And that kind of surprises me because I think of it as so holy, but it was a little bit of a debauched place. He called himself a troubadour and apparently was a really good singer. And the songs they sang, y'all, they were awful. They were gaudy. They made some of what we listen to in the rodeo, on the radio, sound good. So he knew how to sing gaudy songs and these love songs, and they would harass young girls on the streets. It was terrible. But they also, remember I showed you those two little cities so close together? They also, in his young adulthood, they went to war, those two little cities, and he went to war. He was a horrible fighter, very bad, got caught and got imprisoned for a year. And while he was in prison, he got ill. Now, we don't know what it was, but it decreased his health really for the rest of his life, whatever it was. The other thing that seems clear is he was a tad sensitive. He got out of prison and it's like he was thinking about his mortality. He was really, really kind of struggling, kind of wondering, is this all there is? All this debauchery didn't seem as fun to him anymore. I told you about the Battle of Calestra. That's where he got caught. I told you he got imprisoned. He got ill. But he also became disillusioned with the life he'd been living. And one of the cool things about all these wars and all these people coming from other countries is this time period, leprosy spread like wildfire all over Italy. And there was great fear about it. And it was something that Francis just was disgusted by. He writes about this, that it disgusted him completely. And he kept running into lepers wherever he went. Now, he wrote later that that was God who did it. There were just a lot of lepers around too. But these things are starting to happen in his life. And the other thing that all of a sudden he seems to be noticing, now I don't know why he's just now noticing it, but wherever he goes, he seems to find old churches and chapels and hermitages and monasteries that have become abandoned. And they're in disrepair. And it bothers him. Now, why are there so many old churches and hermitages and there have been Christians in this part of the world since the 2nd century, okay? I mean, it is not uncommon that these things would be built and used and then abandoned and moved on. It's also true that people weren't caring that much about these places. They cared about the main cathedral in the center of town, and these other places were falling into disrepair. So one of the things that happens to him, and if you know Franciscans or you ever read a book on St. Francis, you're going to hear about this. He stumbles into a chapel that is in disrepair, San Damiano Chapel, and he is praying in front of this altarpiece. It's a picture of a crucifix, not a real crucifix. And according to the legend and the story, it talks to him, which kind of freaks him out. And basically says to him, Francis, rebuild my church. He's not sure what's really happening, but he continues to spend time in solitude and in prayer. And this message comes to him more than once. And he starts talking to other priests about it. He goes to the bishop, he goes to his father. Everyone thinks he's, you know, a little bit. But he can't shake this. And at the same time, it seems like any beggar who comes up to him on the street, any leper he sees, he feels like he has to give away whatever he has on him at the time. Now his father, who is a very wealthy merchant, is getting very disconcerted by this. Pietro is saying, you are giving away all my cloth, you are giving away all our money, you are making a fool of yourself and making a fool of me. And it gets so bad that he brings his own son up on charges in front of the bishop. I mean, it's a big deal.
And like, what? How old is Francis?
At this point, in 2005, he would be 24, 25, I think. These are some paintings of some of these events. And the thing about Francis is, you know, there are legends, there are biographies written in the 14th century, and sometimes it's hard to know what's fantastical and what's true. But there seems to be a thread that's running through all this. Here's just a picture of, you know, wealthy Francis just giving away clothes. You just didn't give away clothes back then. Here's a picture of him embracing the leper, which I'm going to be using in my sermon today. But this is the moment I want to tell you about, because when he's brought up on charges in front of the bishop, he literally takes everything he owns off, he gives it to his father, he kneels in front of the bishop and he says, I will not, you know, disrespect my father anymore. Pietro Bernardini, he's no longer my father is now the Father in heaven. And basically, he renounces his father and everything. They perhaps, we don't know for sure, but it seems like he never spoke or had anything to do with his family ever again after this. And this bishop became his protector pretty much for the rest of his life. He brought him a coat. He said, come on, let's cover this guy up. He gives him a coat. And he does what any good priest would do. I mean, he was a good man. He knew the family. He sat down Francis. He said, now, you can't be giving away or selling things that don't belong to you anymore. You know, you can beg for your food if you want to. You can go live in a monastery if you want to. You can have silence and, you know, but you can't cause trouble anymore here in town. And so Francis didn't. But I call these in my sermon, there are a number of these moments in in Francis's life that are what I call threshold moments. Moments when he had to either turn away from God or toward God, and Francis didn't know how to turn away. He literally didn't know how to turn away. There are moments when it might have been good if he had, but he didn't know how. His legends continued. He spent a lot of time in solitude and in silence. And in this time period, there are 3 distinct churches that he repaired. He would raise money, mostly from wealthy people, and he rebuilt and repaired these churches. The San Damiano Church, which was the original one where the altar priest spoke to him, will become eventually the place for the Poor Clares, where the women's order will actually make their home. San Pietro della Spina, which he didn't spend a lot of time in, but he rebuilt, and some of his brothers lived there. And then his favorite place, called Portiumiella, or Little Portion, which was literally a hermitage that was falling apart from the 3rd century that he thought was just perfect for his order. Teeny tiny, messed up, full of animals, which is part of his story later too. And there's some really interesting writings of people. He was made fun of a lot during this time period. A lot of people in the church, priests, bishops, cardinals, would make fun of him. But the people who he served, who were mostly poor and lepers, because he just couldn't have enough of them, right? Just were overwhelmed by the experience of love and acceptance that they got from him. And sooner rather than later, dozens of people began to come to him and say, I want to be part of this. Let me join, your work. In the end, there were 3 orders. The Order of Friars Minor, which, we don't speak 1200s, but in cities like Assisi, there were major and minor people. Okay, the major people were nobility. The minor people were the peasants. And so he intentionally called his an Order of Friars Minor. They were not necessarily to be priests. Okay, there are some in the order who become priests, but at the time, they were not priests. They couldn't do mass, anything like that. They called themselves friars, and they were simply to preach and serve. They like other monks, they took certain vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But we'll talk later. Their whole rule of life was incredibly simple and incredibly abbreviated. And other monasteries, like the Dominicans and the Benedictines, thought it was laughable because it was so simple. There were the Poor Clares. Clare, who was also a wealthy noblewoman from Assisi, wanted to join the movement. Men and women could not be together, and religious women had to be cloistered. And so Francis found a way for her and a group of women to create a place in that first chapel, and they became a religious order. Cloistered, they're different though, because they had to be cloistered. They couldn't go preach and heal, and their whole purpose was to pray. And she sometimes would advise both Francis and his brothers. And then there was a third order. There were lay people who desperately wanted to be part of this. And so a lay order was also established of people who could follow this way of life, but not have to take the vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience in the same way.
Do these orders continue today?
Oh yeah. And they've split, and they've multiplied, and yeah.
And these are different than to be like a Franciscan monk?
It is a Franciscan monk.
All 3 of them would be? Or
Just these. just these, yeah, just that.
Is
And
that scissors? Is that
I was just wondering, is she getting her hair cut?
Yeah, you get your hair cut, you cut your hair off and you veil yourself, yeah. So it gets to about 12:10, and now there are dozens and dozens of these, friars, and they have not been blessed by the church. And it was Francis's, and they were in danger of being considered heretics by the church. The thing about being Roman Catholic in 1200 is you were kind of in or out. There was no in-between. And at this point, the Franciscans were kind of an in-between thing. They were neither part of the church structure, nor were they, an order yet. So it was about 1210 when Pope Innocent had an audience with St. Francis for the first time. Do any of y'all remember the movie Brothers, Sun, Sister, Moon from 1970? That movie makes this meeting, it is the climax of the whole movie. I still remember I was 12 or 13 when that movie came out, and it made a huge impact on me. There was a remake of Brothers, Sun, Sister, Moon in the 80s, and that movie did the same thing. It put this meeting as kind of the climax of the story. And in many ways, I think I could tell you it was kind of a climax, because Pope Innocent had to make a choice, and to make a pretty important choice. This movement was really gaining some steam, and it was not going to help him and his cause of political strength. He had lots of problems. He had the Muslims down to the south. He had the Holy Roman Emperor up to the north. He had all of these Italian nobles fighting each other. I mean, he had all this stuff going on. And here come these guys, and they are bringing their rule, their list of rules to get blessed by the Pope. Nothing they were doing were going to help the church hierarchy. They weren't going to get the church wealthier. They weren't going to help the church become more powerful. And it was anticipated that these friars would show up, be mocked, humiliated, and kicked out. That was what everyone anticipated, and that's what the movie played up so well, I thought. That would have made sense. That would have been the norm. There's a legend that Pope Innocent had a dream. I love this. Kind of reminds me of the Gospel of John when Pontius Pilate's wife has a dream, and it made it into the Gospel. He has a dream of the entire church starting to teeter on its side, and this tiny little brown, dude in a robe holds it up with his shoulder. And the legend is that dream made a huge impact on him, and then he meets him. He meets him the next day. What we do know that is true, I don't know about the legend, but what we do know is church historians say he was really taken aback by the sincerity, the piety, the purity of these men when they were sharing their faith and what they wanted to do. The truth is, if I'm going to be a little bit, what's the word? Okay. The truth is, it's sometimes better to have something that you don't quite understand and that you can't quite do anything about under your control.
Keep your friends close and your enemies close.
Right. Than to just let it, And by humiliating them, there's a really good chance that he could have strengthened their cause. And so instead, what he did is he accepted their rule. This is the whole thing. The rule of life of these brothers is simple: live in obedience and chastity without property, and follow the doctrine and footsteps of our Lord Jesus Christ. That doesn't sound complicated until you start seeing what Jesus Christ did. right? Because the whole rest of the rule is just quotes from the gospel. Yeah, like this, like Jesus did this, and he did this, and he did this. And they were things that the church was not doing at the time. There are Franciscans who write, this was the worst thing that could have ever happened to the order, that they got the stamp of approval of Pope Innocent. And there are church historians who write, this is the best thing that could have ever happened, that the church found grace, maybe by the grace of God, to include this reforming movement into the body of the church. I go with the latter, frankly, but you can make your own mind up about that.
Was it
Oh,
not,
go ahead.
it was not like they were competing with the church. They were ministering to people that the church was ignoring? Is that a good?
That's one way of looking at it. The competition would have been for monetary gifts. There would have been some competition for monetary gifts because these friars had to receive alms and gifts from wealthy people, just like the church had to.
Right.
So I don't know how much competition that was. There would have been a little bit of competition. And then the priesthood, I'll get to it. The priesthood, people leaving the priesthood to be part of this order also was a loss of manpower a little bit. Yeah,
I think we're competing here.
go ahead, either one.
Yeah, well, I don't even know what he's going to say. But
Ladies first.
if I recall, at that time, you know, the Roman Catholic Church was very controlling
Incredibly controlled.
in that area. And so I wonder if the Franciscan order didn't want to be associated with them because it was, you know, it was almost mafia-like the way that they controlled. And so I wonder if there was some play at that, saying, no, we're the good guys, we don't want to be associated with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that was part of it. Yeah.
I'm not understanding the argument for why it could be the worst thing. Is it because they're effectively running, to think about it in business terms, at a break even? Like they were doing nothing to benefit. They were just kind of living their own lives without giving anything back and or creating more power for the
Yeah,
church.
what's going to happen 200 years later under new popes is they are going to be given tasks by the church because they are under the see of the pope. They will get tasks, like they will be given the task in 1400 to go to the Holy Land and protect the Holy Land sites.
But at the time,
But at the time, they wouldn't have seen that.
it's like you're doing nothing other than just living and saving,
Right,
you know,
right.
breaking even.
It's only modern people who look back and say, oh, what if they could have just stayed away from the rest of the church? But that wasn't the intent. And it was never Francis's intent either. There are stories. So we have this is 210. He dies in 226, or 1126. 1216. No, 1226. 1226. So there's really only going to be about 16 years of ministry. And in those 16 years, the number of friars is going to grow into the thousands. And they're going to be spread all the way from Spain and Portugal, all down into Sicily, into what is now Syria and the Middle East. They will be making attempts at evangelizing and peacemaking because, by the way, we're also in the middle of the Fifth Crusade, which I don't know if you know anything about the Fifth Crusade, but it's pretty much one of the worst. They're all bad, but it's a really bad one. And so the Franciscans, because they don't know any better, and because they're just following the way of Christ, and because Christ said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," you know, for they shall be called children of God. He makes 3 trips to the Middle East to try and make peace, and again has some success. There are some legends. Some good happens. It was easier to make peace among the city-states of Italy than it was to make peace in the Middle East. The Christians had done some pretty horrible things in the Middle East. You know, so had the Muslims. But he worked on that, went to the Middle East, tried to actually convince the Pope to stop the Fifth Crusade. And then when the Pope was ready to stop it, which he was, the people wouldn't stop. So then he went to the Middle East to try and stop the Knights. He also met with Sultan al-Malik al-Kamil. This is a very famous meeting that we know happened historically, but then of course there are a lot of legends about it too. He went to the Sultan ostensibly to convert him to Christianity. He stayed with the Sultan for a month, and no one left converted, but both he and the Sultan left knowing an awful lot more about the faith of the other than they knew before. And in fact, it's one of the main reasons why the Franciscans, if you've been to the Holy Land and you've been to some of the very ancient holy sites, you'll notice that they're all under control of the Franciscan order. Because they were given that responsibility because they had done some peaceable work with the Sultan, and the Sultan would accept him, would accept them. Those 3 trips, happened. They weren't that successful. He comes back to Italy because all of a sudden, with 5,000 members of the order, while he's been gone, guess what's starting to happen among the men? Oh dear, they're starting to have conflict. They're starting to disagree about things. And in fact, 2 factions are developing, a group of people who really want to spend more time in contemplation and prayer and spirituality, and a group of people who want to develop a stronger, more powerful, evangelizing preaching force. It so reminds me of the split we have in the church still today between those who want to pray and be spiritual and those who want to go do. Yeah.
You're talking about going back and forth. How long does it take back then to go to Italy, to the Middle East, by boat or speed?
It's not that, like some of y'all have done those cruises, right? I mean, you can cruise from Athens, from Italy to Athens to Turkey and then down. It's not as far as you think. Of course, things you did it by boat. Most of you did it by boat.
Yeah, I didn't know.
Yeah, and Paul was going on boat to Cyprus and all that. So to answer your question, a week.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it wouldn't, and especially at this time, they were pretty advanced, shipping lanes by this time. So he comes back to Italy and things are a bit of a mess. He needs to create a new rule. And the new rule is still pretty simple, but he's trying to quell some of the discontent among his folks. It's not easy when your rule is you're going to follow in the steps of Jesus Christ. I mean, the church has always found that, right? You can have 8 really wonderful Christians in a room and they're not going to agree necessarily on what the steps of Jesus Christ are, because there are a lot of steps. There are a lot of ways to look at it. And so they had the same issue. But because they had Francis, they hung together. And he was able to continue to teach them and to lead them. 2 things, one of the interesting things about the update to the rule is it does include specific things about how to deal with Muslims. It's the only order that actually specifically talks about that, because again, the only order that actually went and did it. It also, there's more business about how we're going to eat together, what we're going to do. They weren't supposed to handle money. That was part of their rule, that you didn't handle money. Well, if you're not going to handle money, how do you feed 5,000 people? I mean, it became more difficult. The business part of it became difficult. And in the middle of all this, we have this wonderful story, and it is a true story as far as I know, about the first nativity scene. And did y'all know that he's the one who did the very first nativity scene ever? In Greccio, I don't think I'm saying that right. One night, one Christmas Eve, he was trying to think of a way to have a special service, and because he loved animals, he gathered all the animals around, and they had a family, and they were able to celebrate for the first time. And it obviously was very popular, and it took off. One of the last things that happened in 1226, and all of the ancient biographies talk about this, was in Laverna, on a mountaintop, Saint Francis received what is called in Roman Catholic terms divination. We also call it the sign of the stigmata. There are legends about how that happened, what happened, and this is the prayer. We have very little of Saint Francis' actual writing, but we do have this prayer, which is considered original, which is the prayer that he prayed after receiving the stigmata. And if you don't know what that means he got all 5 of the marks of Christ, hands, feet, and the spear in his side. And that is why he was able to be canonized a saint only 2 years after his death. It's also why they hid his body and buried it under a huge basilica, and no one could find it for 800 years.
How did they find it?
Huh?
How did they find it?
In the mid-1800s, they were doing some reconstruction and looking for it, and they found it. But when it was originally buried, you were supposed to never find his body. This is important in Roman Catholic belief, and I think as Protestants sometimes we're just kind of like, but he's not the only person who receives divination in medieval Christianity. The truth is he suffered tremendously the last years of his life. He was almost bedridden, severely ill, some kind of stomach ailment. It could have been Crohn's disease or something. People guess, but no one knows. And this suffering and the stigmata in Roman Catholic piety and mysticism go together. So no one questioned at the time, and there are plenty of first-hand accounts of this and all that kind of stuff. But it is a Roman Catholic way of saying that even in life here on earth, he was otherworldly. He was special. He was divine. And if you read like the stories of legends, there are all these miracles that he was able to do. He was able to heal lepers. He was able to talk to animals. He was able to, there are many of those kind of legends, which again, not uncommon in the 1200s for those kind of legends to be. And so I don't really know what to tell you about it. I just know that it's really important to Roman Catholics. And most of the portraits and paintings from the Renaissance era of St. Francis, you're going to always see the stigmata. You're going to always see holes in the hands and the feet. He died on October 4th, 1226. The feast day of St. Francis is, and will always be, October 4th. The next day. And so that is traditionally, if you're Episcopalian or Catholic, you bless your animals on that day. And it's a celebratory day. But look how fast he got canonized. Pope Gregory was the Pope at this point, and he had been from Assisi, had known Francis his whole life. He attested to the stigmata, he attested to miracles. And though Francis had been buried very humbly in 26, he unearthed him in 28 and buried his body underneath this. This was the basilica built in Assisi to honor the new saint. And if you go there, apparently, you can see, I guess, his tomb. Now, the thing about Roman Catholic basilicas from the 1200s is they always tell you, this is where so-and-so is buried, this is where so-and-so, and you just kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. Because he's there somewhere, but this is the tomb where you would go and adore him, right? You can do a pilgrim's kind of journey and go to Italy, and you can do a whole thing and see all these chapels, all these places. You can see where the Poor Clares were. You can see where the first hermitage was. You can see that piece that I showed you that spoke to him, because it still exists. The original one has been moved to a place where you can go see it, but then where it actually stood, they have a replica of it now. And so pilgrims do this. I mean, millions of people go and venerate these places and remember this person. So what happened to the order? This is just to show you, this is so typical of iconography. I know that Protestants aren't into iconography. I kind of like it. Iconography is that flat painting that is actually supposed to teach illiterate people things about the saints. And so, of course, you've got your animals, you've got your stigmata, he's a saint, and anyone could look at this on a stained glass or in worship and they'd be, oh yeah, there's St. Francis. This is another really famous Italian painter. And again, you'll see the stigmata, just to make sure that you know who it is. And I think if you look real closely, you can even see the rip in the robe where the spirit would have gone. So what happened to the Franciscan order? Now, I don't have enough time to give you that whole, but it almost immediately fell apart. It reorganized, but that is not uncommon. When the original, kind of person who starts something leaves. And I kind of told you already what the Great Split was about. Some of the Franciscans had become priests, and some were still just friars or monks. Big difference. Some were very interested in praying, solitude, mysticism, contemplation. Others were just dying to go start, more Mobilos and Fishes trucks. Okay, I mean, some things are just don't change, people, because this is still where we are as Christians. It kind of makes me think that the body of Christ needs all of that, right? And so by the time it grew to the size it was, the Franciscan order wasn't just one thing anymore. It was becoming, a little bit more fulsome of the body of Christ. The legacy on Catholicism, though, I wish I were an expert, and I'm not. I can tell you the legacy that these orders left on Catholicism is just absolutely unparalleled in history. Before the Franciscans, there was really only one other order, the Benedictines. And they were not preachers. They were not servants of the poor. They were true mystic, contemplative, cloistered monks. And so there had been nothing like this before. And I could point to so many things in the Roman Catholic Church that are reforming, that would trace their roots directly back to this hunger for something simpler, something without rules, without, and dare I say, without theology. I mean, Francis wasn't a theologian. He didn't write any books about what to believe. There weren't a lot of rules. It was about doing. It was about doing. Remember, it's Francis who told his brothers, preach the gospel always, and if necessary, use words. That's my favorite quote. Yeah, the point is, it's what we do. It's the love we show to the world. And that legacy has not ever been lost. You can see it in someone like Teresa, Saint Teresa of India. You can see it in the Pope today, who chose that name specifically. But the rest of Christendom really has benefited as well. The Dalai Lama, when he went to Italy, and this was in the late 90s, there was only one place. I mean, he had to meet the Pope, because if you're the Dalai Lama and you go to Italy, you got to meet the Pope. Okay, he did. But there was only one other place he wanted to go. He went to Assisi, and he sat in one of the original little hermitages that still exists, that hasn't been made into a grand, whatever, and spent time there. thinking about Francis. Some of his biggest biographers, at least in modern times, were not even Catholics. Anglican, Reformed, Episcopalian. I mean, he really, in some ways, belongs to everyone. His biographer, who I'm going to quote in the sermon too, says, Francis is a witness to a living and acting God. Shows us what God can do to radically alter our lives and our world. Because he stood on the margins of the world and called into question the folly of relying on money and power for happiness. And I don't think that is a message that goes out of, style. I mean, I think that there is still as much, if you talk to young people, 20, 30-year-olds, what they think about the church, okay? And they're not very educated about the church, I shall say, okay? But they think they know what the church is. And what they know about the church is what? Rules, judgment, hypocrisy, long list of what you can do and not do, long list of what you should believe and not believe, and everyone's always arguing about what to believe and not believe, and who's in and who's out. And they're not completely wrong. They're not completely wrong. The more educated and a little more with it young person wants to say, and yeah, the church has been like in the pocket of power and wealth and kind of hasn't been separated from, the power mongers in the world. And if it were really religious, the church shouldn't be all involved in politics, And they're not all wrong either, right? And so this way of thinking about Francis still seems very fresh to me. It still seems like it could have legs, and does have legs, in a world that frankly isn't as interested in rules and doctrine and, who's in and who's out and who's right and who's wrong, but is starving for love, starving for acceptance, starving for what he would call real joy and real peace. I want to end with a few quotes by some famous Franciscans, because the order is still very much alive and well today. They are not, beggars on the street like they would have been in Francis's time. The Franciscan orders, have houses and churches. They have their own churches that they run. They've got, schools. Franciscan monks become priests. They get doctoral degrees. I actually was in a doctoral program with a Franciscan priest. So, the world has changed and the order has changed. What has not changed is what they value. And that value they still bring to the Roman Catholic Church when they can. Richard Rohr, as many of you know, is a Franciscan. And he has written a book or two about St. Francis. But mainly he's written about why St. Francis is still appealing to people today. And here's what he has to say. Now remember, he's got his own, he's also a mystic, he's also a contemplative, so he has his own perspective. But he says, Francis does not really provide any systematic answers to theological questions, which is true, as much as he is a living answer to those who are asking the right questions. And that's a modern Franciscan thinking about their founder. Like Mother Teresa, we look to them for what they did, how they lived the heart of the gospel, rather than the theology or the doctrine. And it's true, unlike Aquinas, some of the, like the Benedictines or the Dominicans, who have tons of writings by their founders. Franciscans, they don't have anything except that a couple of brief orders and some prayers that may or may not have been written by Francis. Mainline Christianity has too often missed out on the freedom and joy of the gospel and settled for nice, proper, and culturally accommodating, I think is what it's supposed to say. I don't remember how this ends. But that's Richard Rohr from a modern perspective saying, Francis is kind of answering a yearning that the modern church might also, need to pay attention to. The central practice in Franciscan mysticism is that we must remain in love. And this is the thing I forgot to say earlier. If there was one thing that St. Francis would have taught, John 15 is the one gospel passage that he quotes in the rule again and again and again. Remain in me and I'll remain in you. Abide in me and I'll abide in you. And I know it sounds simplistic, but Francis really thought if they could all just stay in the love of God, that everything was going to work out. They weren't going to have any problems. The Muslims would be converted. Everything would be finished. The wars would be finished. If we just remain in love, everything is going to be fine. Only when we're eager to love can we see love and goodness in the world around us. It's that perspective that if you're in love, and he called himself God's troubadour, which is like lover. If you're in love, then you see love. If you're in peace, then you see peace. And it sounds simplistic, but this is his heart. This is what he believed. And this is what he felt worked. And for a modern Franciscan mystic like Richard Rohr, he sees that as the tradition that he has inherited. What's interesting too about Richard Rohr is Francis would have been critical of the church of his time. And so as a modern Franciscan, Richard Rohr follows that tradition of being loving, but also critical of the church of his time. Yeah. Then there's Pope Francis. Who y'all know is a Franciscan, right? Some people want to know why I wish to be called Francis. For me, Francis of Assisi is the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation. It was no accident when he took this name. It is not a name that has been used by popes. And it was a statement of intention, and it was a statement of value. One author I read, I didn't want to quote him because I don't know if he's a kook or whatever, but how you're reading this stuff, you're like, I don't know if this guy's a kook, but he said, the cardinal electors must have gasped in horror when he named himself Francis. And I'm like, I don't know, they gasped in horror, but it had never been done before. And the reason being that Francis, that whole movement stood against the solid, powerful, wealthy, status of the church. So I thought that was interesting. Now here's something else that Pope Francis said in a sermon in, St. Peter's Square or whatever. And this was quite a few years ago. But it just, to me, it resonated with St. Francis. The Lord calls you, I would like to say, to those who feel far away from God and from the church. I would like to say respectfully to all those who are fearful or indifferent. The Lord calls you too. He calls you to be part of his people, and he does so with deep respect and love. The Lord is waiting for you.